Well, UK Prime Minister Theresa May is taking her Brexit battle plan to the austerity-hit streets of the UK. And joining me now is Jeremy Corbyn's former Shadow Communities and Local Government Minister, Chris Williamson. Chris, thanks for coming back on. Before we go to the constitutional and political Brexit crises, we heard from the Russian ambassador in part one. What do you think about leaks suggesting Foreign Office funding for journalists to attack Russia, to attack nation states, perhaps what the government perceives as...
Well, in my view, it's completely inappropriate, unacceptable for the government to be funding something like that, if that's true. I think that, we should be reliant on government to, play things with a straight bat, really. And I think once you start getting into that sort of black propaganda, which this seems to suggest they are doing, then it calls into question, I think, many of the sort of statements and positions that, the government's taken up. And I know that, for example, a number of us, when we sort of asked questions about some of the assertions which were being made at the time, in relation to the attack in Salisbury, for example, asking for evidence, we were pilloried for having the temerity to do that. And when you then see this revelation, you kind of just wonder what on earth is going on. And I just think that it's inappropriate, unacceptable, really, for the government to be engaged in these sorts of activities. We saw this back in the 1970s when Harold Wilson's administration were being undermined by the security services in this country. And for a democracy like Britain to be engaged in this sort of activity, we should be above that kind of thing. And I think certainly very serious questions need to be asked about what government involvement there actually was.
I should say the Foreign Office, we have asked for comment. They haven't come back to us with any direct comment.
Well, I will be certainly making inquiries using parliamentary procedures to see whether we can unpick some of this stuff, because I do think, the public has a right to know, what is the government doing getting involved in this sort of activity? You don't expect this from the British government, do you?
But all the journalists named and some MPs in your party, no fans of Jeremy Corbyn, all of them.
Well, that's true, and again, this also leads one to have very serious concerns, about some of the motivations, about some of the stories, what's going on. I mean, and if it turns out the government's behind, some of the propaganda against Jeremy Corbyn, funding, government department, perfectly acceptable, obviously, for a political party to be doing that. But, to be this sort of shady organisation, if that proves to have been involved in that, well, that calls into question, doesn't it, the sort of whole democratic process in this country.
On the other hand, the head of the British Army, General Mark Carleton-Smith, former SS paratrooper, says Russia is a bigger threat to the people of Britain than ISIS-Daesh, and that's after, the Manchester attack.
Well, I just think these sorts of outpourings are just absurd. I mean, they're just...
That's the head of the British Army.
Well, it may be, but, some of this stuff, it just doesn't help, I don't think. I mean, this kind of hyperbolic sort of statement, really, I think brings him into disrepute, to be honest. And I think we need some sort of level heads, really, here. And this is why I think, Jeremy Corbyn is such a breath of fresh air, because, he approaches things in a dispassionate way, seeks evidence and wants to make, policy decisions based on real evidence, not just on this sort of, exaggerated sort of nonsense which we seem to be getting from people who ought to know better and set a better example.
You say it's disreputable. What do you think? Islamist terror and, poverty are bigger threats to the people of Britain?
Well, clearly they are major threats to Britain, but in terms of what threat Russia poses, I mean, I could think of other nations around the world that potentially have more of a or pose more of a threat to Britain. But I mean, just in terms of the day-to-day lives of ordinary British people, clearly poverty, when we've seen the UN report recently that 14 million people in the fifth biggest economy in the world are in poverty, where we've got a likely increase in poverty amongst children, 7% increase over the next few years. I mean, we could be by 2022, according to the UN Rapporteur's report, be in a situation where 40% of children in the UK are living in poverty. Now, these are real threats. These are real challenges to the way of life of millions of British people, far more, it seems to me, than anything that Russia is saying or doing at the moment.
You see, the Windrush disgraced, albeit prior Home Secretary, now Welfare Secretary, as it were, Amber Rudd, says the report you're referring to is extraordinarily political, She's the government have slammed it. Theresa May's government has slammed this United Nations report you're referring to.
Oh, I know they have, and that again...
Inappropriate, discredits itself.
Well, I think the only people that are inappropriate and discredited, frankly, are the government. And Philip Alston himself said that rather than attacking the report, the government should act on the recommendations that he made. And it really does shame Britain, I think, for a country with the size of the economy that we have, to have a situation where millions and millions of people are living in poverty, where we've got in every town and city in this country people sleeping in shop doorways. This just can't be right, and we have to address this as a matter of urgency. And it seems to me, the rapporteur chose his words carefully, and I think he was genuinely shocked by what he found. And this is direct consequence of political decisions that have been taken by this government in particular, but I think successive governments are in the frame, but this government in particular is directly responsible for the parlous situation that we find, or millions of people find themselves in now.
Well, that's what the UN is saying. You think the Prime Minister is using Brexit negotiations and her agreement as a bit of a smokescreen, and perhaps Jeremy Corbyn at any televised debate between the two of them on the agreement will be making this point, that the UN rapporteur's accusations are arguably more pressing at the moment?
Well, listen, I hope that Jeremy will raise that if he gets the opportunity, if this debate goes ahead, that the Prime Minister is allegedly challenging Jeremy to a debate. It's interesting, however, that she ran for the hills when the general election was held last year. She was not interested in having a debate then. I suspect that the only reason she's calling for a debate now is that she feels that it might give her some advantage, given that she's been intimately involved in this agreement that she's reached with the EU, and hopes perhaps that she can demonstrate that she's in command of her brief. But I think Jeremy has certainly agreed to take on the debate, and I'm sure will be able to offer a much more hopeful vision for a Britain outside the European Union under a Labour administration than the one that Theresa May is putting forward now. And, I think if we get the opportunity to have that debate, I'm sure Jeremy will put that case very effectively. And I think what we want, of course, is a general election. We desperately need a general election to get out of this parlous situation that we're in. We've still got months till the time we come out of the European Union. That does give us some time to go back to the EU, a new Labour administration, putting forward, an expansionary, interventionist proposition to, address the massive challenges that the country finds itself in now, and indeed those challenges will be exacerbated somewhat potentially on the outside of the EU, which is why it's so important, I think, that we negotiate on the basis of an interventionist government and having a relationship with the EU, which enables us to have a permanent customs union, a bespoke customs union, and tariff-free access to the single market.
Okay, but just finally and briefly, as for the 100,000 children arguably going to be affected this Christmas because of the rollout of universal credit, the government is saying that loans can be given to these children and they can go into debt in the interim. What do you say?
Well,
the Peabody Trust is saying 100,000.
Indeed, I've seen the Peabody Trust report. It's an utter outrage. It really is. I'm so angry about this. It's appalling, and it's just it's compounding the issues that the rapporteur highlighted in his report.
But nothing can be done before Christmas, basically.
Well, yes, of course, something could be done before Christmas. This is about political will. And what they're talking about is plunging, 100,000 kids into poverty at Christmas at this very special time of the year. Yes, of course, something could be done about it. With political will, we could make sure that people got the resources that they need. But listen, universal credit, in my opinion, needs to be completely scrapped. We need a root and branch revision of our social security system in this country. It is no longer fit for purpose. It's completely broken. It doesn't provide a safety net anymore, and it's frankly it shames Britain. It further compounds the shame that Britain is facing as a consequence of the report that was just produced by the UN, highlighting the terrible situation in relation to poverty in Britain.
Well, the government stands up for it, says it's a good thing. Chris Williamson, thank you very much.